Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this learning session. I see a lot of folks still joining here. I'm so pleased to welcome you to this session of the 2019-2020 Learning Exchange Series with the Forest Climate Working Group. I'm your host, Lauren Cooper, and I'm the lead of the Forest Carbon and Climate Program at Michigan State University. I'd like to take an extra moment here to wish you and your loved ones good health and resilience in this challenging time. And thanks for making the time to join us today, probably from your home offices of various configurations. If you're unfamiliar, the Forest Climate Working Group is a diverse group of forest interests with over 50 members, including landowners, industry actors, conservationists, academia, and those active with carbon markets. The group has worked together for more than 10 years to advocate for state and federal policies that work to ensure sustainable forest use and the prevention of land use change. To get to today's speakers, I'd like to introduce Bryan Van Stippen, the Program Director for the National Indian Carbon Coalition. And today's session will focus on the coalition, the National Indian Carbon Coalition, and their activities in developing capacity, outreach activities, and carbon projects with tribal nations. So thank you in advance to Bryan for the presentation today. We'll learn about the services that the NICC provides to tribal nations, Alaska Native villages and corporations, and Native Hawaiian organizations, as well as how the NICC works with tribal communities to help navigate the carbon market. Before we hand over the microphone here, I'd like to cover a couple of housekeeping details. To automatically receive registration information about the webinar series, please email us at forestc@msu.edu to join our email list. Attendees today are qualified to receive 1 CFE credit from SAF, and this will be automatically communicated to SAF, and you will receive credit if you've registered with your SAF account. So if you have any questions about this, please reach out to us again at forestc@msu.edu. For those interested, the session is being recorded and will be posted to the web, along with any supplemental resources, links to relevant other additional resources, and as well as the presentation slides. And this will happen in about the next week or so. If you've registered, you'll get an email letting you know where to find this, but it is easy to find on our website, the Forest Carbon and Climate Program, along with any previous recordings. So we have about 2.5 years of recordings there, so it might be worth a scroll through to see if there's something interesting that you missed in the past. For Q&A, this session will be followed by a Q&A, but we do strongly encourage that you submit questions at any point during the presentation. On your Zoom interface, you'll see a little chat button with a little drop-down triangle next to it. Here you can offer up questions, again, at any point during the presentation, so feel free to throw out a question instead of trying to remember them at the end. If you're calling in by phone, but you do have access to email and you'd like to email a question, you can send them to us directly at forestc@msu.edu and we'll add it to the mix. In the case of outstanding questions, we will work with speakers to have these addressed and we'll post them in a PDF format along with the presentation materials. So I think that's about it for the background. So with that, Bryan, will you please share your screen and begin today's presentation?
Thank you for the introduction, Lauren, and thank you for inviting the National Indian Carbon Coalition to be a presenter for the work group. I'm very excited to be here today. As you mentioned, I'm sure most of us are either working from home or secluded in our offices. I reside and my office is located in Green Bay, Wisconsin. So I'm in Central Time Zone today. I believe we would have participants from all throughout North America. Today I'm going to do an introduction of the National Indian Carbon Coalition, our services, some of the projects that we're working on in Indian country, as well as some of the challenges and benefits of what we see for carbon sequestration projects in Indian country. To a brief introduction of myself, my name is Bryan Van Stippen. I am the Program Director for the National Indian Carbon Coalition. I've been the Program Director for the Coalition for the last 3 years, and at this point in time, we have not yet gotten a project to market. One of the main things that we're working on is getting those projects approved. I was hoping by today that we would have had 2 projects approved, but obviously with the situation that we're currently in, my meetings the last few weeks in front of tribal councils were canceled, and so we have not been able to get those projects approved. I was going to be able to divulge a little bit more information on some of those projects, but as we currently stand, I cannot do so, but I can give some brief background on my current projects that we're working on, which I will do so here in a few minutes. I am a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, so I'm a tribal member enrolled at Oneida. I am a former tribal attorney. I used to work for our tribal court system in Oneida, our law office, as well as for the Ho-Chunk Nation in western Wisconsin. So my career out of school was working in Indian country, in the Department of Justice, tribal court systems, and tribal legislatures. And then I transitioned over into the nonprofit sector, becoming the program director for the National Indian Carbon Coalition, which allows me to move back to my home area, in which our reservation lies just outside of Green Bay, Wisconsin. So we have a 65,000 reservation lands that encompass part of the city limits of Green Bay, and then run to the southwest of Wisconsin outside of the city of Green Bay. So we have a fairly large registration with 17,000 members. And we are currently in the process of working with my tribe on a project, but we have not yet determined what we are going to do, so I won't be divulging too much about that project at this point in time. Further, I try to give these presentations in front of tribal councils, tribal membership, tribal staff. I changed it up a little bit specifically for this type of opportunity because it didn't really flow well. A lot of times in my role as the program director, I'm trying to educate leadership, staff, and membership as to what these projects entail. And we start at the very first step of essentially what is carbon, what is your carbon footprint, how does carbon sequestration work, before we flow too far into the process. But again, I wanted to mix it up a little bit, specifically for this audience, because I believe there should be a solid foundation and understanding of what these projects entail and some of the issues that we see with trying to get them brought up off the ground. But again, I'm going to do a brief introduction here then of the coalition itself and how we work with tribes in our process that we do to try to get tribes interested in entering into a project, and then leading the tribal nation, Alaska Native Village Corporation, and Native Hawaiian groups, as well as First Nations out of Canada, through these projects. And this is my first time using Prezi. I wanted to do something a little bit different than PowerPoint, so I'm hoping this works pretty well. So we were formed by the Indian Land Tenure Foundation and the Intertribal Agriculture Council. Both of those entities are very well known and respected in Indian country. NICC was created in 2010 because there was a big push at that point in time to get tribes involved in carbon sequestration projects. So we had seen a lot of entities and what we like to call some fly-by-night organizations that were getting up off the ground, trying to enter Indian country to develop projects on tribal land, and create. There were some issues with how those organizations were approaching tribes. As I mentioned, we have not yet gotten a project to market, and a lot of times it's just waiting for tribal councils to make decisions. They're busy people, they're elected officials. They don't always have a focus on what a carbon sequestration project may entail and mean for their reservation. So a lot of times it's stepping a tribal council, tribal staff through that process so they understand what these all entail. And again, what we had seen in 2010 were a lot of organizations that were basically knocking the doors down on tribes, trying to get them entered into projects and not divulging the requirements in the scope of what these projects all had needed to be conducted. So what we do is that we try to work with the tribal nation. I have received a 2015 Conservation Innovation Grant to enter into carbon feasibility studies for tribes. We call them carbon assessment feasibilities. That was one of my roles, was trying to get a tribal partner to want to do a feasibility. It was at no cost to the tribe. My role was to get the funding, pay a third-party consultant to do the work, and then help the tribe run through the process once the feasibility was conducted. So we want to focus on, through the Indian Land Tenure Foundation and Intertribal Agriculture Council, our focus is on trying to help tribes preserve their cultural resources without extraction or exploitation, as well as being able to purchase traditional territory with homelands back. We believe that entering into carbon sequestration projects were one of the ways to allow tribes to do so, to drive some revenue off of their natural resources, again, without extraction or exploitation of those natural resources, and then be able to manage that land and derive revenue off of it. So we saw some of these economic opportunities by entering into carbon sequestration projects. A handful that we have seen come on the market are generating between $20 million to $120 million in revenue for tribes at this point in time. So some of the benefits that we wanted to look at are going to be the revenue generating opportunities, preservation of tribal lands, promotion of land stewardship, greenhouse gas reductions, promotion of soil health, ecology, diversity, and such. So what we're seeing in Indian country right now is a lot of tribes have approved the Kyoto Protocol internally, so they're trying to adhere to those standards, stating that they're going to have greenhouse gas reductions or be net zero by 2030, 2040, 2050, whatever their tribal council has determined. So they're trying to be the reduction of their greenhouse gas emissions or become net zero by those timeframes. So when we produce some of these feasibility studies, what we have seen through the carbon sequestration ability, especially on forested lands, is that if the tribe elected not to sell those credits on the market, that they would be net zero. But obviously one of the goals of these projects is to derive revenue. So it's up to every tribe on what they want to do with those credits, if they want to state that they are net zero or whether they are going to be able to sell those credits. So one of, again, with the rules we work is that we try to work through the complexities of the market. Carbon projects are complex. Tribal membership, tribal staff, tribal leadership do not have a great understanding of carbon sequestration. As I mentioned, my background is a tribal attorney before taking this position, so I myself have a steep learning curve as to what these projects entail. I had to do a lot of background research, took some online classes, worked with Michigan State classes schedule as well to see and understand what these all projects entail and how they work. One of the big things that we want to do is that we want to provide the data to the tribes when the feasibility are completed. Our statement is that this information is owned by the tribal entity, nobody else. So we do enter into non-disclosure agreements with all these organizations to ensure that that the tribe knows that any information that they share will be held confidential, which is obviously extremely important to tribal councils. Interestingly, one of the main issues that we ran into early on was web mapping. Again, as I mentioned, I worked for the Ho-Chunk Nation. I did a lot of the land acquisition for the tribe. I did a lot of leasing, rights of ways, land in the trust applications for the nation. And one of the things that we worked on internally was basically getting a smart board for the tribal council, an electronic map to see where lands were located, because tribal membership wanted to know, or excuse me, the tribal leadership wanted to know where the land was located in relation to other tribal properties. When you're working on leases, who the lessee was, who the lessor was, who was living around that area, and trying to do that with paper maps was just very difficult. So we worked on implementing a web mapping system with the Ho-Chunk Nation. When I got out working with other tribes, unbeknownst to me, many tribes did not have a GIS or a web mapping department. So it was a service that we started looking at, how can we provide these? And I can tell you horror stories of where we're meeting with a tribe and I ask where their land holdings are, and they'll roll out a Department of Transportation map with little red circles on it saying this is our land base. And that was a very difficult issue to try to overcome early on when tribes didn't have an understanding or knowledge of where their land holdings were. So we focused on trying to help develop web maps. We provide that service to this day yet, where we work with tribes to implement an electronic mapping system so they have a better understanding of where their tribal land base is, because we needed that information to develop the feasibility study on for the carbon sequestration project. So it serves a dual purpose, but when I'm working with tribal nations, my main statement is this is going to help you as elected officials to make more informed decisions on your land base and how you want to move forward. So that's some of the issues that we had to overcome early on, but has been a great service that we've been providing. And I think we've done up to 12 electronic web mapping systems for tribes now all throughout the country. And I'm currently working on one with the Shoshone-Bannock tribe out in Idaho. And then the last one, yeah, how do we integrate projects, which is always difficult when you're working with tribal nations to move them forward. So once we start meeting with tribes, we get into the nitty-gritty of what these projects mean. One of the things I want to just point out to this audience is the methodologies that we are focusing on. These are the first three: improved forest management, avoided conversion of grassland and shrubland, and compost additions. We've done pilot projects with those three and protocols and methodologies. The main one that we are focusing on are the top two: the improved forest management and avoided conversion of grasslands, because those are essentially the easiest ones. The forest management, for one, is the easiest carbon sequestration project to move forward with, and for two, tribes are mandated to have forest management plans in place through the Bureau of Indian Affairs if they have forested lands within their reservation boundaries. And so we know what tribes have forested lands and which ones don't. And then on top of it, forest management are at this point in time the most lucrative. They derive the majority of the revenue more than grassland projects at this point in time. The fourth one that we see there, thermal energy production with or without electricity, we actually created in conjunction with the American Carbon Registry to focus on a particular tribal project, which I'll get into a little bit. But I'm hoping to be able to utilize that thermal energy production with or without electricity for further projects. So we just recently created that protocol and got it approved through American Carbon Registry at the I think it was the end of June last year, and we're working on getting our first project accredited underneath that methodology. So again, what we're looking at when I start talking to tribal nations, how we move forward with projects, once we enter into an MOU, which again takes quite some time simply to go through internal tribal processes, we enter into an MOU to develop the feasibility. What developing the feasibility means is data sharing between the tribe and my third-party consultants that I utilize to develop the feasibility. Most of the information is publicly available, but there are certain land aspects that we have to be in consideration of tribes. One of the main issues are culturally sensitive areas. Many tribes have natural resources that they utilize in their cultural practices. One basic one is basket weaving. So black ash trees, who use the bark for basket weaving. Tribes want to keep those areas protected, and sometimes even from their own tribal membership, because they don't want just people going out there and taking and utilizing all of those resources. So what we try to do is work with the tribes to make sure that they're keeping those areas outside of these projects, and then also helping them map those areas, which is something that they appreciate as well. So once we get done with the feasibility, we enter into the quantity inventory. Most of the time this is a forest-based project, so we do the forest inventory and step through the modeling and reporting to get the project certified and accredited through one of their registries, which is the next step. Once it's into the registry's hands, it's out of our review for a while. We can't do anything. So we're waiting for their approval. And what we've seen in the past with other projects is it takes between 6 and 9 months. Then we get to market. One of the main questions that we will get to in a little bit here that tribal nations, tribal leaders have, membership and staff, are what type of market do we want to go on? Do we want to go on the compliance market and the California cap and trade, or can we do a voluntary project on the voluntary carbon credit market, which we're starting to see those markets come into fruition a little bit more strongly here. But those are questions that we answer along the way. And then this is another concern that tribes have is dependent upon entering into the voluntary market. or the compliance market, the duration of the projects, which can range from 400 to 100 years, with the 100 being the minimum for entering onto the California cap and trade. So those are the project steps that we walk through with tribal nations as they go through the process of entering into a project. So this is some of the information that we're looking at that we request from the tribal nation itself, or help develop in the case if they don't have this information. Again, I use a third-party consultant to help develop this information. Many times tribes will pick who they want to utilize, obviously because there's certain requirements per tribal law that states you have to do 3 bid processes, or at least bring in multiple bids on a project, including carbon sequestration projects. So these are some of the things that we're looking at when we're looking at economic feasibility. How much carbon is your land sequestering? You can develop that into a calculation and show which the revenue is going to be created. The 2 main areas that we focus on is obviously the land area, how much forested land you have, and then how dense is your forest. One of the tribal nations that we're working with right now does have forested lands, but it's very wet, so they consider it a forest wetland, and trees are very scarce. So it's a little bit difficult to do the feasibility to get an accurate count until we do the forest inventory, but that's one of the issues we have run into along the way. We are also working with an Alaska Native village in northern Alaska, and one of the foresters we sent out there came back and said, I cannot find a tree with a search warrant out here. So we were unable to move forward with that project simply for the fact that the density of the forest was not as strong as that we were hoping when we first entered into the agreement. What we've kind of found as well is that we want for a minimum number of acres to make it economically viable is around 3,000, but we can get around that depending upon density as well. So again, a couple of things that we have to take into consideration when we're trying to move forward with a project is getting approval from tribal councils. That's always, it takes time. Like I mentioned, the meetings last week were canceled, obviously, to the current situation that we're in nationwide. But prior to that, I was in front of council to get approval, and the tribal chairman had an emergency meeting that he had to go to, and our meeting got canceled. And that happens more often than not, where we're on the agenda, something comes up last minute, and we get pushed back. So unfortunately, I was in the tribal council room, the meeting was canceled because the chairman couldn't make it. We pushed the meeting back 2 weeks, and then again, we've hit this current situation where there's no travel and travel restrictions. So that was unfortunate timing for us. I was hoping to be able to, again, give you a little bit more information on that project, but we were unable to get that approved through tribal council at the time. So again, it's sitting on where all that stands. And then we have to go through the Bureau of Indian Affairs to get approval, but the Secretary of the Interior and the BIA has basically stated, no, we don't care what tribes do with their carbon assets, but we still need to get a letter from the BIA stating we don't care what tribes do with their carbon assets. That's all the one sentence letter states. That we have to submit through one of the registries to be able to participate in the California market. Internally, the questions that I've run into and the concerns that I get from tribal council, tribal staff, tribal membership is that there is a requirement for a limited waiver of sovereign immunity. All tribes have sovereign immunity, basically means that they cannot be sued by outside entities unless that immunity is waived. In this case, for carbon sequestration projects, it's going to be limited to saying that once you enter into the market, you're going to protect your natural resources according to the plan that you provided through the registries. Obviously, there's financial risks. The carbon market moves up and down, so you're not necessarily guaranteed our projection rates. It's just a risk that you have to take. The other concern is the 100-year time frame. In order to enter into the California cap and trade market. That's the minimum requirement. A lot of times tribal leaders are only elected for 3 years at a time. Tribal leaders don't necessarily want to be making decisions that are going to bind future councils for 100 years. So there is a little bit of a concern at that point, even though in my personal opinion, protecting your land for 100 years is a good thing because tribes have been here for time immemorial. Tribes are going to be here for time immemorial. What's 100 years? But as an elected official, they have to take that into consideration. There are upfront project costs as well. To get some of these projects up off the ground, it can cost anywhere from $200,000 to $800,000 in your first year of project development. So there are upfront costs that tribes have to come up with those dollars with in order to enter into projects. That's basically to bring the project developer on board. And then of course, future investments. What that means is that any lands that they put into these projects cannot be touched for the duration of that. So if there's going to be tribal housing or there's going to be development of some sort, we state immediately just don't even consider putting that land into these types of projects because we don't want to 30 years down the road have to be taking land out of the project if the tribe decides this is a spot where they were going to put housing up. So we have to make sure that we're taking all of those into consideration on the front end. So there's a few of the steps when we're looking at the development. What do we want? The forest, grasslands, biomass, weatherization. Tribal weatherization projects are starting to look like they might be extremely lucrative, but there's not a lot of data out there yet on those types of projects. Inventory, what are we going to use? How much is going to be available? For instance, I mentioned I'm a Oneida Nation tribal member working with the tribe on a project. We have about 4,000 acres of forested land. So what we don't believe that's going to be enough. So we're trying to determine whether or not we can combine a project with a grassland or agricultural land project, and then modeling how many credits can be generated and how much revenue is going to be generated off of those credit sales. One of the other issues that we have to point out to tribal nations are the fact that we have a verification process. Every year, there has to be annual monitoring that can be done in-house by the forestry staff or natural resources staff. But every 6 years, you have to bring an outside third-party consultant to do a verification in order to participate in the California cap and trade market. So again, that's another cost that we build into the front end to make sure that tribes are aware of what needs to be done. And then implementation costs, do you have to bring on staff internally to be able to enter into these projects? I was contacted a few years ago by a tribe that hadn't done a project, and what occurs often everywhere is staff move on, staff retires, people change jobs. But there was a whole new staff put in place at this one particular tribe that had entered to a carbon sequestration project on the California market, and they didn't have any of the background documentation as to how the tribe had entered into this project. So they're calling my organization wondering if we had participated in it. We had not helped in that particular project. So that's one of the things that we're working on now is trying to develop a clearinghouse or a data storage area internally on these tribal projects, because again, tribal leadership changes, tribal staff changes jobs, retires, new people come on board, and they don't have the background understanding of what the decisions were made on entering into these projects and what their requirements are. So it's something that we've seen as an issue now that there have been some projects that have been approved and been operating for a while. As I mentioned, we worked with the American Carbon Registry. The other two are VERA and Climate Action Reserve. Those are the offsite registries that the California Cap and Trade Program works with. So again, when we are meeting with tribal councils, this is the four main concerns that we've run into: was the duration, particularly with the 100-year time frame, the limited waiver, the commitment from the staff, and the long-term land management decisions. So we've come up with some information on how to overcome these issues. So again, we're looking at the California Air Resources Board requires the 100-year time frame. Again, in my personal opinion, I don't view this as an issue. What we try to do when we are talking to a tribe is look at lands that they have already entered into some sort of a program. There's many federal programs out there. Tribes work a lot with NRCS to do sustainable management practices. That's one of the things that we try to focus on with tribal nations are, if you have NRCS lands and NRCS practices, let's focus on those first. Because you're already in some sort of protected status, you're already working in some sort of program, and you can do this as well. Limited waiver of sovereign immunity. This is some of the regulations right out of the Air Resources Board language, a bunch of codes in there, but basically what they're saying is that we want to ensure that tribes are going to do what they say they do. And when you start talking to a tribal council about waiving their immunity, there's a large concern. Again, as a tribal attorney, I would see sovereign immunity waived often, simply for the fact that in order for any tribe to do any sort of lending, it is a requirement from the industry that there's a limited waiver provided within mortgage documents or lending documents that state that if obviously you don't pay your loan back, you're going to get sued. So tribes often enter into limited waivers of sovereign immunity. They often don't realize it. So it's just an educational process. And there are some tribes out there that just say, we're not going to enter into these carbon sequestration projects because we are not going to waive our sovereign immunity. And it's not an argument that I'm going to try to make with that tribal council. If that's their opinion and that's how they feel about things, I'm not going to say, well, I think that you should do it because you do it in other instances. But that's unfortunately been some of my experiences in the past where they're like, we're not waiving our immunity, so we're not interested in the project whatsoever, even if it could be extremely lucrative for that particular tribe. So here's some of the tribal projects that are ongoing. The most recent one is the Spokane tribe in 2018. You can see on here that Yurok tribe has entered into 3 different projects, and White Mountain Apache has entered into a few projects as well. So the tribes that have done it have had some good experiences. Obviously, there's been some bad experiences as well, but these are the projects that we've seen that have been successful. So now I can get into some of the projects that we are working on at the National Indian Carbon Coalition that make us pretty excited. The Lower Brule Sioux tribe of South Dakota. This was a project that was underneath our original pilot, the avoided conversion of grassland to cropland. At Lower Brule Sioux, they have a contract with Orville Redenbacher to provide popcorn. So popcorn is a very lucrative crop for the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. However, after years of participating in this, they've seen that a lot of the topsoil was blowing away or being depleted of nutrients, and their crops weren't growing as well. So we're trying to convert some of it back into grazing, grasslands, the traditional prairie lands. Interestingly, they have a black-footed ferret and a bison project going on right now with the prairie dog. So they found that through the ecological system, black-footed ferret, bison, and prairie dogs all work well together. You can revitalize the soil. So we are focusing on some of that acreage in order to enter it back into grasslands. The unfortunate thing about the project is because it is a grassland project, it's not very lucrative. The revenue being generated from that is minimal. They still want to do it because it's practices they're already doing. So that was one of the hurdles that we are trying to overcome. The second hurdle, interestingly enough, is that we are utilizing the Plan Vivo standard out of Scotland. It's used elsewhere in the world, but there has never been a project approved in the United States. I actually have a conference call tomorrow with the project developer because we should be getting that project certified within the next few weeks. But we are trying to introduce the Plan Vivo standard into the United States through this project, which would be, again, first of its kind. We're also working with the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. They're just outside of Duluth, Minnesota, in northern Minnesota. They have quite a bit of forested lands, but again, they wanted to focus on lands that were already entered into an NRCS program, which led us to around 9,900 acres. It's actually down to about 8,900 acres right now. And that was the project that I was hoping to get approved a few weeks ago. but the tribal chairman was unable to participate in the meeting, so we pushed it back, and then the meeting was canceled again due to the current situation that we're in. Leech Lake Bend of Ojibwe is also in northern Minnesota. It's outside of Bemidji, Minnesota. Same and similar project. Working on some forested lands that they have there. Hopefully, we have a meeting again tomorrow with Leech Lake staff to get this project to move forward, just to try to overcome some of the hurdles that we run into. One of the most promising is with the Keweenaw Bay Indian community. They're in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, outside of Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. They have 17,000 acres. It's already in a protected status. There's been really no hurdles, with the exception of tribal council meetings being canceled frequently. So it's been a little bit of a struggle to get in front of their tribal council. The last time I was up there, it was interesting because there was a group presenting before me from the Lime Timber Company. Lime Timber had purchased a lot of the forested lands around the Keweenaw Bay Indian community, and they were talking about that they are going to be obviously doing some commercial logging, but they were also exploring carbon sequestration projects on that land. Some of the staff from the Lime Timber Company were stating that they were just getting certified a 30,000 acre project in northern Wisconsin to be entered into a carbon sequestration project. So I had not heard that before. I thought that was very interesting. Lime Timber Company is a huge forest holdings organization. So to find out that that entity is exploring carbon sequestration projects along commercial logging was a great opportunity for me now to go out into Indian community and talk about the projects that that entity is working on, because a lot of tribes do have commercial logging operations, but there is concern that if they enter into these carbon sequestration projects that it will hinder their commercial logging operations, which it does not. They should work in parallel with one another. But again, it's difficult to have those conversations at points in time with the commercial logging entities, because they're looking at how do we make money off of our logging operations, not protecting our logging operations, which they do anyway. The thermal energy production with or without electricity is a protocol that we created along with the American Carbon Industry that focuses on Coda Energy, which is the organization's name. It's 51% Shakopee Mid-Wakanton Sioux community owned. Shakopee Mid-Wakanton Sioux are located outside of Minneapolis, St. Paul area. They're a smaller tribe, but because they have a small tribal base and their casino operations are right outside of Minneapolis, St. Paul, they have a lot of dollars that they generate. So what the Shakopee wanted to do was develop this energy company, energy producer actually, I should say, in conjunction with raw melting. They utilize an agricultural byproduct from Kellogg's cereal to create power. So they moved off of natural gas. They create all of their power with agricultural byproduct, and then feed that power to raw melting into some of the community in their area. So it was a very interesting project. We're hoping that we can bring this protocol to other organizations, other tribal entities that we are seeing that are implementing woody biomass boiler systems. Northern Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, North South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho. It's cold in those regions. A lot of tribes are on propane in those areas because they cannot get natural gas service. So what we're seeing now is a push for tribes to enter into woody biomass boiler systems to heat their casinos, hotels, health facilities, administration buildings, senior centers, community buildings. So it's a big push that we're seeing, and as a tribe enters into developing a woody biomass boiler system, we can then build a carbon sequestration project on top of it. It's not extremely lucrative, but it helps offset costs of the facility. We are working with a handful of other tribes right now in the early on stages, just developing the feasibilities, but I'm hopeful here that between Fond du Lac, Leech Lake, Keweenaw Bay, that those projects will be approved here in the next few months, and then we'll start being able to report on those a little bit more and provide more information as to what those entail. So one of the things I wanted to show were just a couple of resources that we can use. And again, we'll be sending these slides out. We developed a guidance for tribal projects in conjunction with the American Carbon Registry to talk about how these projects can maybe work on tribal lands. So that was one of the projects that we had to conduct underneath our 2015 Conservation Innovation Grant. It's a handful of pages talking about tribal land ownership, some of the issues. One of the things I did want to show was this map from NRail. I thought this was pretty interesting. It is just a down and dirty way to determine what type of resources may be what type of carbon sequestration opportunities there may be. So again, if this thing ever comes up, I'm just going to show you Oneida, where we are located, but it looks like it's taking too long. And then one of the other projects that we're currently working on that we have not quite are ready to release yet is what we're calling our carbon calculator. So as the National Indian Carbon Coalition, we are calling this TICO 2E, which is Tribally Invested Carbon Offset Calculator. We can go on here. I have not yet launched this, although it's technically live. So for instance, I was going to go from Green Bay up to Duluth to meet with the Fond du Lac Band. I was going to be there for 2 days, and then you can pick what it was for. I'm just going to say travel, and it's going to show you how many miles I'd have to go, how much carbon emissions I'm going to have, and how many trees I would be able to save if I offset my carbon and greenhouse gas footprint. So this is one of the projects that we're working on. This calculator was just developed recently. We were going to plan on launching it this month at a conference. And again, obviously that conference was canceled, but we are now working on what we call a general living calculator as well. That would take your entire household and your household usage from waste, utilities, water, everything into developing your carbon footprint. So that was there. When I was talking with Lauren and Daphne about this project, we came up with a handful of questions, but I'm getting up here to the end of my time, and I do see that there have been some questions asked along the way. So I thought we could toss these out here at some point, but I still wanted to try to get that. Still not loading. I don't know why that tribal atlas isn't loading, but if you have an opportunity, it's a very interesting tool to use, and it can be utilized for any lands within the United States. It's pretty interesting. It was developed by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory out in Colorado, so it's an extremely powerful tool to just give you a down and dirty idea of how these are, what types of resources your lands may have, and the carbon that can be sequestered on those lands. So as I mentioned, we're seeing more and more interest in these projects. When I started 3 years ago, I get yelled at a lot. Tribes had not very much interest in it. It was new for the most part, complex. I was ran off reservations in the past because there was no interest. But it took me a long time to figure out my messaging, how to get in front of tribes, and to not push the issue if they weren't interested. So again, it's been a steep learning curve for myself. As I said a couple of times, we have not yet gotten a project to market. As we move through those, that's going to be a whole new learning experience for me as what these projects entail for development. I'm looking forward to it. But there's going to be, again, many hurdles that have to be overcome for these projects to be approved. So with that, I see we're on our time. Again, this is just a joint project. There's my contact information. I've had conversations in the last few weeks with Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund, other entities and associations that are interested in the development of these projects, helping see these projects get up off the ground. So there's a wide interest in developing these projects in Indian country. I know there's a lot of project developers that are working with tribes. They do a lot of good work. My role is just to ensure that tribes understanding what they're getting themselves into, and trying to make sure that the tribe derives the majority of the benefits from a project. Everybody needs to take a piece of the pie. We're all out there to be self-sufficient, self-sustainable, and that's one of the roles that I want to make sure that tribes are aware of who they should be working with, what they want to be doing, and how they want to be entering into these projects. So with that being said, I think I'm at the end of our time, and I don't know if I can do this correctly.
Oh, you're fine, Bryan. Oh, sorry.
Where in Canada has NICC done work? I have only had some conversations with some First Nations, particularly White Sand First Nation out of Canada, but we have not yet done a feasibility in that region. I have spoken with, I want to say another 2 or 3 organizations out of there that I've run into as we see more of these climate change conferences coming online. There's a big one in San Francisco every year, navigating the world carbon market. And I did meet with the climate minister for Ontario, as well as the climate and environmental individual for their federal government up there. But there's a lot of First Nations that are interested in these types of projects as well. And as I am foundation-based, I can work throughout North America. As I mentioned, I also work with some Native Hawaiian groups out in Hawaii, because there's a lot of interest in that region as well. So as long as it's Indigenous population generated or geared, my boss has said, go for it, go work with those organizations and entities as well. As I mentioned, what we kind of consider, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna let you know, I can kind of moderate these questions for you, because there is a related question about First Nations in Canada as well that came in on the chat. So if you'd like, you can just relax, and I've kind of organized these questions for you, and I can let you know this related follow-up when you're done with the first part.
Okay.
There was just the follow-up question was, are there any thoughts on handling a different regulatory environment if considering engaging with First Nations in Canada compared to tribal communities in the United States?
Well, the good thing with carbon sequestration projects in Canada as well with First Nations is that the California market and the Ontario carbon market are connected. So you can work through the California cap and trade market with the market that's developed in Ontario, Canada. And so it makes it much easier to cross-relate. Obviously, there's different issues on the internal government First Nation base compared to the lower 48. But that's also the difference between Alaska Natives corporations and villages is much different than working with the tribal nation in the lower 48. So there are nuances for each organization and entity that you're working with. And again, that's where some of my background with being a tribal attorney comes into play, is that I have an understanding of what those entities and the nuances between each.
Great, that's really helpful. Another couple of questions we got here were related to kind of some of the technical aspects of project size and components. So this question is, do you have a sense of what have you seen as a minimum amount of carbon or land that's required to enter into a carbon market?
So my project developers that I've worked with and talked to in the past have said they would like to see a minimum of 3,000 acres of forested land, because that is going to make sure that there's at least some revenue derived for the tribe. I mean, we can enter into projects smaller, but between the development costs, it's just going to eat up all the revenue. So a tribe could potentially do a project on smaller acreage, but they won't make any money. It'll just go towards development costs. So what we try to recommend is a minimum of 3,000 acres. We do want to see that be densely forested, because that is going to give us the best ability to derive some sort of revenue. As I mentioned early on, the projects that we have seen are between 20 to 120, 150 million dollars in revenue, but they're large land-based forested tribes that are able to do that. As I mentioned, Oneida, we only have 4,000 acres. Fond du Lac, we're looking at around 9,000 acres. No, those are going to generate a decent amount of money, but not, that's hundreds of millions or tens of millions of dollars. So again, we're trying to make sure that it's economically viable for the tribal nation, as well as for everybody to get paid, because California market takes a little bit. The registries take a little bit, and obviously the developer takes a good chunk because it takes about a year for these to get, once a council approves the project, it takes about a year for it to get to market.
That's really helpful. Do you consider the types of trees or the current age of trees when you are considering the likelihood of qualifying for a market or a market-ready project?
The types of trees are not all that vital for the most part. It's the age of trees that are important. A lot of times with tribal projects and tribal forested lands, tribes don't harvest as often as maybe a commercial logger does. So a lot of times what we see is that within the tribal forests is that those trees are 60 years and older. And when you're trying to calculate the carbon, you're usually looking at trees that are 40 years or older. And so with that 20-year head start, we've noticed that tribal projects are extremely lucrative when you can get enough acreage into the project.
That's really helpful. We also have a number of questions here kind of related to the markets and opportunities. So one question is, are you looking at both regulatory and voluntary markets? You've mentioned California a couple of times, but can you just elaborate on the markets you're looking at, and if the California market's the only regulatory market that you're considering? So
as I mentioned, yeah, California is the only market right now that we're looking at. It's tied to Ontario, but that legislation changed last year, and that market is changing in 2021. Currently, I want to say it's $17.16 a metric ton for a carbon credit. But the expectation within that California market is next year that's going to drop to between what they're guessing right now, like $12 to $14, $12 to $15 a ton. So as we're doing these financial projections, we don't know when the market changes in 2021 what the true value they will be. One of the things, again, why I wanted to show that calculator is that we are trying to develop our own internal voluntary fund to help these tribal projects get up off the ground. As I mentioned with the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe, the feasibility that we're looking on with utilizing Plan Vivo was $5 a metric ton, because that's going to be a voluntary carbon credit project, as well as the Dakota Energy project we developed with ACR. Those projects are only certified to go on the voluntary market, and the voluntary market sells between $5 and $8 a credit right now, and sometimes that makes the project not economically viable. So we've been working the last 2 years on how can we develop a funding source to provide a larger revenue for tribes to go on the voluntary market. My preference is the voluntary market. I did not mention, which I don't know why, I forgot about this. One of the big issues that we often have when I'm talking to leadership, membership, and staff is, well, we just don't want to allow polluters to pollute by entering into the California market. And that's not truly how the California market operates. What I usually say, it's you're fining a polluter by making them and requiring them to buy carbon credits. So it's a little bit of an issue that we have to overcome, is getting past that mindset of, well, entering into carbon sequestration projects and selling them on the California market are allowing polluters to pollute. So then my statement is, well, let's enter the voluntary market, but then the council has to determine whether or not they want to be able to sell at $17 a credit or $5 a credit. And a lot of times as elected officials, they're looking at the revenue that can be generated. Obviously, it's a good story and everybody's glad to be protecting your land. But again, as an elected official, their concern is, what is in the best interest of our tribe, and can we derive revenue off of our land base, which I don't fault. So again, it's up to the tribal council. I present a feasibility on both markets, and then it's up to their decision. Again, that's where I've been in front of the council these last few meetings that we were hoping to get approval, was asking that question to the council. For one, do you want to continue with the project, which hopefully say yes, but then two, which market is your preference? Do you want to do the voluntary market, in which we're looking at this price point, or do you want to do the compliant market? The good thing is that, I want to say Corsica, is the airline industry is entering into their own market, which should be coming online here fairly soon. And we're expecting that the airline industry will be purchasing credits at a little bit higher rate than what the current voluntary market is coming in for. And as well with the new legislation that California passed through the state legislature, that the compliance market might come down a little bit. So those price points could be much closer together. And I feel that tribes would be much more comfortable entering into the voluntary market. But again, it's up to the tribal council as to which direction they want to go in.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I also want to make a quick note. We did get a question. There is interest in the link you tried to share. And this is a perfect example of something that we will post when we have the recording. We can also distribute it afterwards. If you want to email us, anyone that really wanted to get their hands on that link right away, shoot us a quick email at forestc@msu.edu and we can send it out afterwards. But we can post this when we post the recording. And yeah, Bryan, I think sometimes just with everyone working from home, the bandwidth is so limited on the internet that this kind of afternoon time gets tricky to both stream and upload things. So I've had a couple issues myself with that. So apologies that that didn't work the way that you wanted it to, but we can definitely get that link out to those that are interested. We have quite a few questions. A couple more that I thought we could touch on kind of quickly is one is on finance. How are long-term monitoring costs covered, and are tribes setting aside this funding upfront?
Yes, that's built into our feasibility, and once we work with a project developer, those costs are set aside on the front end. Usually, from my understanding with the projects that have been approved and are ongoing, is that funds have been set aside in a separate account to pay for any of the verification, any other type of work that might need to be done, so that is not being taken into consideration as the revenue being generated for the tribe, so that they know that is going to be covered for the duration of the project and is set aside on the front end.
That's helpful. Another question, a couple questions we had here was linkages to certified sustainable standards, so SFI or FSC. Can you elaborate on if these are required for the projects that you're engaging with, and if they had that type of certification lined up in advance?
They're not required, but it is extremely helpful. So I have been trying and working with SFI to help get tribes to become certified. SFI has a lot of First Nations that are certified. There's only one tribe that I'm aware of in the United States in the lower 48 that has their forest certified. But a lot of that work that is done for the certification project is a leg up on getting entered into a carbon sequestration project. So if there are tribes, First Nations that have that certification, you're a quarter of the way there to getting a carbon sequestration project certified. So it's beneficial, just not a lot of tribes in the lower 48 have that currently.
That's helpful. And so I have a couple of specific questions that for those that entered these about some specific tribes and corporations. I'm going to have Bryan respond to those in written form, and you're also welcome to reach out to him directly, but he will respond to those when we post. But I thought for our last few minutes, maybe we could wrap up with a higher level question, and just hear your thoughts on what trends you expect to see in regards to your organization and carbon markets, and particularly, do you see certain regions capitalizing on these opportunities more than others? So what are the general trends you're expecting, and where are you seeing some specific regional activities?
So as I mentioned, when I first started in this position, I got yelled at a lot, and that's not a lie. I mean, I got yelled at when I'd be at my vendor booth getting grilled by tribal leaders or tribal elders or tribal members because there's a lot of concern over these projects. So it's been a lot of educational process. And I will say with this current federal administration stance on climate change, more and more people are taking interest in what the industry means and what it entails. And so my conversations have changed over the last few years because there has been more interest. Climate change has been in the news a lot more often, and people want to know more. So it's been trending in the right direction. A lot of times what I tell tribal nations when I'm working with them is that my ultimate goal with the carbon sequestration projects is to derive revenue to create more projects, to do more renewable energy projects, energy efficiency projects. As I mentioned, like woody biomass boiler systems, energy efficiency projects on your tribal buildings, weatherization projects, because the long-term goals for many tribes are going to become energy self-sufficient. Blue Lake Rancheria in California a few years ago, when they had the tsunami in Japan, a lot of people fled up into the mountains where the Blue Lake Rancheria was located, and it inundated their community. They realized that they did not have the infrastructure and the capacity to house, feed, keep people when a natural disaster may occur. So they implemented a microgrid system, used Tesla batteries, solar power, different types of renewable energy to create and store energy. When they had the wildfires last year, they were one of the only entities in that region that could operate their hospital, their hotel, and their gas station. They were saying they were having people coming from an hour away to get gasoline and to get food and other resources that the tribe had put in place because they were still able to operate and run. So we're seeing a big trend by tribal nations on becoming energy self-sufficient. And again, with this type of situation that we're currently in, my expectation is when I have the ability to start meeting with tribes again, our conversations are going to revolve around what did we just go through? How do you be energy self-sufficient, food self-sufficient, because there's a big push for food sovereignty in Indian country right now as well. But how do you implement these practices so that if there are issues like this, that you can still house, feed, and clothe your people on your reservation lands? So my expectation is when we're through this pandemic, that there is going to be even more interest in the projects. And I will say that I have a handful of tribes up there, specifically the Northwest and in the Plains area, that are extremely interested. I just haven't gotten the memorandum of understanding approved yet. They're going through the process. But my expectation is a lot of the tribes in the Northwest have large forest-based lands. They're going to move and trend in this direction, as well as a lot of the Plains tribes, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming right now are really starting to pick up steam. And I think I'm going to have a lot of interest in that region as well in the next few months to get projects up off the ground.
Well, Bryan, thank you so much for that, those kind of closing thoughts. I think that was a perfect way to wrap up this super interesting and insightful session. So thank you so much for your time preparing and joining us today. Thank you to everyone who dialed in and spent an hour with us. As a reminder, this is being recorded and it will be posted as soon as possible up on the Forest Carbon and Climate Program website. If you'd like to join our email list, again, it's forestc@msu.edu. And a quick plug, May 6th for our next learning session, we'll have a talk. We're going to be transitioning for the last two sessions looking at wood utilization at two different scales. So it's kind of a part 1 and part 2. So we hope to see you on the May 6th session. So once again, thank you so much, Bryan. Thanks to everyone. I hope you all have a great afternoon. Take care. Stay healthy.